Okay, everyone, welcome to the Radical Anthropology group. This evening we have Mark Kosman, who has been a very long time supporter of radical anthropology and who's trained as a historian, but perhaps better known, at least in London, as quite a prominent figure in the anarchist scene, and he's written many articles, mostly in activist journals, and is particularly interested in revolutionary politics. And as a historian, he's brought to light a lot of stuff that very few of us knew about the extraordinary role of women in at least initiating revolutions throughout history. Women initiate the revolutions and have a lot of power at the beginning of these events, and tend to lose the power quite quickly to the dominant sex, having done that. But he's also recently taken an interest, of course, in the unfolding bungling of the coronavirus pandemic, and I'll keep letting people in. So I've said enough. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Chris. Yes, I'm going to be covering a lot of areas, and hopefully it will encourage some thought. Not too much agreement, hopefully lots of debate about a topic which I'm sure we've all been giving a lot of thought to over the past terrible year. My proposition basically is that the coronavirus disaster that we've all been experiencing over the past year is a sign that capitalist civilization is on its way out, that it just can't cope with all the problems that are heading in our direction over the next few decades. It's certainly not the first time that a virus has, give me a second. Not the first time that a virus has brought down a civilization. The Roman Empire, for example, was brought down by the bubonic plague, and then another variety of the bubonic plague, the Black Death, brought down feudalism right across Europe in the 1300s, and that in fact led to labor shortages, which in turn led to a whole restructuring of the feudal economy, which eventually led to the collapse of feudalism and the rise of capitalism. And then more recently, say another big pandemic, the last huge pandemic, of course, in 1918, the influenza pandemic had many effects on the world. It actually had a major impact on what was happening in India, led eventually to the partial collapse of the British Empire. And during the First World War seems to have affected German and Austro-Hungarian soldiers more than the Allied soldiers, and led to the collapse of the German and Austro-Hungarian Empire. So viruses certainly do have their effect on history. Now we're all being told, and I think quite rightly, that the coronavirus pandemic, it's beginning to come to an end. But of course, many scientists are saying this is just the start of a whole series of pandemics that for various reasons are going to be hitting us over the next few decades. And one of the factors that is increasing this danger of pandemics is, of course, climate change or global warming. And that itself has enough reasons to worry about, not least of all, it's hard to know where to start with global warming. But for example, huge swathes of India, the Middle East, Africa look to become uninhabitable in the next few decades. If that wasn't enough that's facing humanity over the next century, we have a situation where the 2008 financial crisis still hasn't, we haven't got over that yet. Plus, of course, there's a major unprecedented world economic crisis because of coronavirus. And again, most economists are predicting a whole series of other crises. There seems to be no resolution to these. And on top of that, if all that wasn't bad enough, many other experts are suggesting that we're closer now to nuclear war, perhaps between America and China, or India or Pakistan, than at any time since the 1960s. And what's most striking about all these disasters that seem to be coming our way is they're all they're much more difficult things to deal with than the coronavirus. And yet, because we have societies, especially in the West, which obsessively prioritize the economy over everything else, especially human life, they seem to be paralyzed and completely incapable of coping with all these problems that are facing us, which is why I am suggesting, I don't think it's too presumptuous to say that capitalist civilization is probably on its way out. And one sign of that is that Britain, arguably the earliest fully capitalist society in history, has dealt with coronavirus in particular absolutely disastrously. I mean, the death rate has been just so much higher than so many other countries in the world. And considering the advantages Britain had, considering the advantages that Britain had, it's been quite an unmitigated disaster. And I think it's very tempting, and I certainly agree, that a major cause of this disaster has been Boris Johnson and his government and their utter callousness and incompetence. But I think it is a great mistake to just focus on that. There are institutional, structural reasons, systemic reasons why British capitalism in particular has been unable to deal with this any better than it has. And they're not just due to Boris Johnson. And the evidence for that is there's much, but the most basic evidence is that the scientific advice that Boris was given back in the spring was itself so disastrous. And those scientists, I assume, would have been the same scientists who would have advised any government that was in power. So I'll give you a couple of examples. There's a guy, John Edmonds, you might have seen him on television, one of the top epidemiologists in SAGE. And when asked, as you would expect him to be asked by journalists, why did Britain take so long to go into lockdown? And he simply said, we did not think it was politically acceptable to shut the country down. Now, why a scientist is quite making that decision, but it just seems to me there's an extent to which even the scientists in this country have imbued with this idea that the economy is above all else. Neil Ferguson, an even more important epidemiologist who was setting the agenda very much back in the spring, said something very similar. He said, I quote, when he was asked in Parliament why Britain simply just didn't copy what was happening in Asia. Clearly they had tremendous success in China in the early months of getting rid of this virus. And he simply said, there would be clear advantages economically to having the epidemic over by the end of the summer. I'll quote more of that later when I'll show you some PowerPoints. But the bottom line here is that this is epidemiologists, British epidemiologists, the best in the world, emphasizing again and again the priority is the economy. So I don't think we can just blame the Tories for this obsession with the economy. And the result of all this was not that they didn't have a lockdown. We did have a lockdown, but it was weeks and weeks too late. And now we've got ourselves to a state where I think if you judge the figures not by the official figures, but by what's called the excess deaths, i.e. those who have died this year, who compared to those who died in a similar period last year, we're talking about something like 70,000 dead British citizens. I mean, the tragedy is just unbelievable. When you compare it to, say, World War II and the numbers who died in the Blitz and all the bombings that Hitler did during World War II, it's similar numbers. I mean, Johnson has killed almost as many British people as Adolf Hitler, or civilians, we're not talking about soldiers. And it's just staggering what this country, and of course so many others, have been through. And it's particularly staggering because there was a very clear alternative early on in this pandemic, which we could see coming from China, which was to have a proper lockdown, one in which millions still didn't go to. I mean, there was never a proper lockdown in this country. As I understand it, hundreds of thousands of people who really didn't have to go to work were still going to work, still filling the tubes, still mingling, still spreading the disease back in March, April, May. And this meant that the disease was never got rid of completely. But if they had had a proper lockdown in that period, you could have got rid of the disease almost entirely in 5-8 weeks. And then from that position, been in a situation able to stomp out any other outbreaks of the virus. Of course, you would need much more than that. You would need massive investment, billions being spent to revive the NHS, to revive the whole public health system, to pay people to stay at home when they're isolated, and when we still have a huge problem. Now, I read there's some claim, I'm not sure how accurate it is, but it's probably tragically quite accurate, is that 80% of people in Liverpool who've been asked to isolate, sorry, 80% of those people who've been asked to isolate, who then asked for this benefit payment in order to be able to afford to isolate and not go out to work, have been refused the benefit payment. I mean, that's just one example of the chaos within the British system. It is really quite outrageous. And as I said, it's very clear from New Zealand, from Australia, from Taiwan, from South Korea, there was an alternative way, and the British just refused to go in that direction. And of course, in the long run, over the past year, they could have done so much more than just have a decent test and trace system. We could have also started rebuilding the transport infrastructure, buildings, in order to maintain better social distancing. I said this would have cost a lot of money, but there are other pandemics coming down the line. So it seems the most obvious thing to prepare for those. And also, if we're talking about other issues, climate change, for instance, to really start investing in restructuring the economy towards public transport, the changing buildings, many other things that need to be done. And the great advantage of this massive expenditure that needs to be done to keep this society safe from these various ecological catastrophes that are facing us is that spending all this money will boost the economy and therefore prevent the economic slump that looks to be coming our direction. So in a sense, I'm making it far more easier than it appears to be. But the real mystery of not just British capitalism, but Western capitalism as a whole is why are they not even going in the direction of restructuring the economy, of investing in what is necessary in order to prevent these various ecological and other disasters that are facing it. And it's one of the big questions in Western politics, and there are many possible answers to it and many different angles that one can look at. But I would say that the fundamental problem is that the people in charge of our society, the ruling class, the capitalist class, the politicians, whatever you want to call them, they're basically scared. They're scared of creating a situation where the government is taking responsibility for the economy, for people's living standards, for their jobs, for their incomes, for their housing, for their welfare provision. Because once the government starts taking responsibility for such things, people keep demanding more and more. And even worse than that, of course, when people have that level of security and they know that whatever the economic crisis, whatever the ecological crisis, whatever the pandemics, the government will look after them, they then start working a bit less hard. Maybe they even start organizing themselves in trade unions or going on strike or even questioning, why are we still in the 21st century facing one of the most advanced societies on the planet on this rather miserable condition called wage labor. Now that may seem a bit much. Is that really why the capitalist class in this country can't get their act together, can't even save their own system? Well, we could discuss that in the discussion later, but I think there's something like that going on. And of course, it was in the 1970s that Western societies did begin to fall apart, partly for those sorts of reasons. There was a huge countercultural rebellion, many strikes were going on, and there was this sense in which you could just make ever increasing demands of the government. And this is the one thing I think that the British capitalist class, in particular, Western capitalist classes and others, are terrified to go back to. And I think this explains their paralysis. I think that's the only word I can use. Total paralysis when it comes to dealing with the imminent disasters that are facing the world or will be facing the world in the coming decades. As I said, not just the present coronavirus pandemic, but other pandemics, other ecological crises, obviously climate change being the biggest one, and the fact that we're in a situation where there's an apparently endless cycle of economic crises, which seem to be getting worse and worse. So if I'm right, and I appreciate this is something we can debate in the discussion later, if I'm right that the politicians are not going to save us, that it would be a huge mistake to keep waiting for them to get their act together, whether it's on climate change or preparing the world for future pandemics. What is the alternative? Well, the alternative is something like a global revolution, something like a mass movement which transcends capitalism and creates a different world. And who would lead such a movement? Well, these are huge questions. Traditionally, Marxists, anarchists, others have looked to factory workers, metal workers, the miners, perhaps, you know, when I was a young person back in the 1980s. That seems, I think, pretty unlikely that that section of the working class are going to lead us. Not to suggest for a minute that factory workers and others won't be a very important part of any massive social upheaval. But I think actually an even more crucial sector of workers, which I think count for something like 10% of the entire global workforce, are carers, nurses and other carers. It's now a massive part of the world economy. And it's not unimaginable to think of a situation where another pandemic is about to hit us. Imagine the scenario of what it was like back in February, March, when we knew what was coming, but the government were paralyzed. If that happens again, well, it will happen again. I suspect what will happen is Western governments will be paralyzed again, and it will be up to nurses, carers, others just to go out onto the streets and just demand immediate lockdowns and immediate change in the way things are, and to start containing this situation. Whether that itself would lead to a world revolution, or who knows what it might lead to. But I think it's not unimaginable you could have a situation in which paid carers, and of course unpaid carers, I mean the numbers of unpaid carers in the world, if you include parents, is many, many billions. Such a movement, it's not inconceivable that such a movement could arise. And one of the reasons I argue that, and Chris hinted to that when he first introduced me, is that this isn't the first time that something like this has happened. The two greatest events in modern history are arguably the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution. And in both cases, the key events which radicalized both those revolutions, that initiated the really radical parts of those revolutions, were when carers, in this case mainly mothers with children, were enraged that their children were starving, some of them literally to death, in conditions of massive food shortages, and they proceeded to turn their world and then the entire world upside down. So in October 1789, the French Revolution had already started, but there was a problem, to say the least. The market women of Paris were enraged that their children were starving, and they got together. They said, we're going to take over. They denounced the men as cowards. They grabbed weaponry and they marched in the pouring rain all the way to Versailles, where they did something which was certainly unprecedented in European history, as far as I know, which is they kidnapped the king and his family, and they marched them all back to Paris. And it was that act, the March to Versailles, which radicalized the entire French Revolution. In fact, women didn't just stop there. They kept demonstrating and protesting across Paris in those years, and kept radicalizing and pushing the revolution ever further to the left for a period. It didn't last forever, and we can go into that as to why revolutions go so far and then fade out. But what is intriguing is the fact that something with many differences but so similar happened 100+ years later in the Russian Revolution. It was on the 8th of March 1917, International Women's Day. The working class women of Petrograd, again, were absolutely enraged that their children were starving, and they not only staged food riots and a strike, they went into the factories, they dragged the men out and said, we are going to make the revolution. Now, the men knew, people had expected a revolution for a long time, but nothing had happened. This was at the height of the First World War. Everyone expected it to happen later or not then, but the women said, no, this is going to happen now. We're fed up with this situation. And within 5 days, the Tsarist regime had collapsed. So before I get completely carried away with revolutionary history and the prospects that something similar might be happening again or might happen again in the 21st century, I do want to add a more pessimistic note, which is, of course, I'm not suggesting that such a revolution is inevitable or imminent. There is another alternative. Give me a second. And the other alternative is, of course, that we could be heading towards the extinction of the human species. But because our governments, our politicians are incapable of facing up to the problems that are facing them, and incapable of restructuring the economy, restructuring politics in order to deal with various ecological crises, climate change, pandemics, threats of war, economic crises. But the one consolation for this incredible dilemma that the whole of our species is now facing in the 21st century is that we've been here before. We've been in a situation where either we take action, either where we have some sort of popular uprising, or we face the extinction of the species. And by that, what I'm referring to is some, who knows exactly when and how many times it happened. But my understanding of our evolution in Africa, some 200,000 or so years ago, is there were very significant climatic changes going on, maybe not quite as severe as they are now with man-made global warming, but certainly severe changes. And the only way as a species we were going to survive, whereas at the time other hominids were dying out or had died out, was if we could harness the power of the males. So when they go out and hunt, they would contribute the meat to the females and to the children, and that way brain size could expand, and we could basically, by having these cultural rules, we could transcend the usual primate habit, which, as I understand it, is only individual feeding of the young. It's not done collectively in that sense. And that transformation for our species, for small numbers, did take place in Africa. And it's that which enabled us as a species to deal with this rapid climatic and other ecological change. In other words, the point I think I'm making, and as RAG, people who come to RAG meetings, I think you'll have some understanding of what I'm talking about. The point I'm making is that in the past there was this serious threat of ecological and other disasters, seriously threatening the extinction of Homo sapiens, as well as just like every other hominid species or most other hominid species that had died out at that time. And it took something like a social revolution in order to put human care, the care of children, at the center of that society and create what, you know, we perhaps could be called hunter-gatherer communism or nomadic hunter-gatherer social relations. And it's not just a RAG view. It's not controversial to say such a transformation from the sort of alpha male dominant societies of other primates to a situation in which you have a cultural control of society, in which you have something like communism, certainly extreme egalitarianism. There must have been some kind of uprising, some kind of social upheaval. It can't just have been a genetic change. And the point I'm going to, well, end on in this part of the talk is just to say the point I'm trying to make is it is not unreasonable to compare, in my opinion, what happened 200,000 or so years ago to what the issues that are now facing humanity today, which is that what we need is some kind of species-wide upheaval, uprising, in order to deal with major ecological crises that are threatening the extinction of our species. And that uprising will have to put human care of children, elderly, other vulnerable people at the center of our society, not the market, not the economy. And so I think you can make a comparison between what happened at the origins of our species 100,000 plus years ago and the dilemmas that are now facing us in the 21st century. It's a big claim. It's not a claim that many of my friends, Marxist or otherwise, take that seriously, but I think it is one, considering how drastic and terrible this past year is, that we need to take seriously. And before, I've got a PowerPoint and I'm going to show you some slides and sort of summarize my argument, and then we'll hopefully have a discussion. but I will just end this section on just to think back to what it was like back in April, March, May, where we were all locked down. And the one thing that we all knew is there wasn't going to be much mass activity, protest, demonstrations. You couldn't even go on a demonstration because it would be illegal and you would be not socially isolating. And then in that situation, what happened? Well, you had the explosion of protest in the US. I think it's the biggest protest movement ever in US history, the Black Lives Matter movement, which then of course spread worldwide. Now, I think that's a sign of what's going to happen in future decades. We seem to be entering a period of rolling crises combined with mass popular explosions, which sort of appear to come from nowhere. And that gives me some hope in these desperate times. Now, I'm now going to do something which may or may not give me hope, which is I'm going to try, if I can, Chris might want to help me and give me advice, I don't know, to show some slides. How much more time do I have, Chris?
Plenty of time, half an hour at least. Brilliant.
So I've got to press the button called share screen, haven't I? Here we go. And there we go. Is that the right one? Yeah. That's it. Brilliant. And now I've got to do. Now I am. Slide. Okay, maybe I can do it. Slide. No.
It's all right, isn't it? I can see it.
Well, you can see it, but how do I get to the? I've got the thing which is doing the Zoom business.
Well, don't you just go to and fro? Oh God. Can't you just do what you normally do with the PowerPoint? Why have you gone mute? Oh, Mark.
Can you hear me now, Chris?
I can now, but yes. There's nothing wrong. I can see your slide.
You can see the slide?
Yeah. Go back to the problem.
Okay. How do I get rid of, let's give me a second. I'm almost there. Sorry, I'm not very experienced in all this. Ah, right. Now I can actually read my slide. Is the slide fine, Chris?
It's fine.
Okay.
It does suck.
Right. Now, Peter Daszak, he is quite an interesting person. He is an expert on bats and other species. Wait, just give me a second to turn that on. Bats and other species. He's been studying in China and elsewhere. The zoonosis, the extent to which viruses leap from one species to another. He in fact says along, I think, well, his group, they estimate that there's something like between 700,000 and 800,000 viruses in various animals across the planet, which are ready to leap into humans at any time. It's quite scary stuff. Here he says, and this is actually, this quote is from the David Attenborough BBC documentary Extinction. Okay, and Dr. Daszak says, we estimate that there are going to be 5 new emerging diseases affecting people every year. We cannot live with that. And the rate at which they are increasing and crashing our economies, if we have one of these every decade, we cannot persist with that level. And as you can see, I've written here, Dr. Daszak is now in charge of the Lancet Task Force on COVID origins. So that's a rather depressing quote. I'm now going to go to an equally depressing picture if this thing is working. It might not be. What do I do? Page up? No, page down. Okay, nothing seems to be allowing me to change. Oh, there we go, back. That's it. Right, another depressing picture. This is of Tournai. This is a town in Belgium at the height of the Black Death back in 1349. And there you can see they're burying the dead. I forget whether I mentioned it or not, but I think some estimates say as many as half the population of Europe died during the Black Death. As I might have, again, not said, it was that the population declines of that period created a situation of labor shortage, which then meant that the feudal lords began renting out land to peasants, and that was, if you like, the beginning of agrarian capitalism. It utterly transformed first Europe and then the world. So an interesting period, but also incredibly depressing to see the suffering that went on. What is striking about the suffering, of course, in this period is no one knew the cause of the Black Death. They didn't know how to prevent it. They didn't know about fleas and all the other things and viruses and the such like. And so, well, it's almost understandable and forgivable that they had to bury their dead in this depressing way. What is less forgivable is this. It is the fact that back in March, April in New York, this is the richest city in the richest country in the whole of human history with the most advanced technology and scientists, and they just couldn't deal with this virus at all. And to this day, America is in some ways the worst in the world, the United States rather, in terms of coping with coronavirus. I think the figures are 270,000 people have died. Some are guesstimating that 400,000 will be dying by the end of this pandemic, which I think is similar numbers to who died in the Second World War. I mean, it's just I keep saying the same thing, but it's not good. And the most shocking thing about the way in which Western capitalism, in particular Britain and America, but other countries as well, have dealt with or failed to deal with the coronavirus disaster is the fact that it was so relatively easy to cope. And we know that because, well, China, and I'm not a fan of the Chinese regime. And the point I'm making here, to compare the Western failures compared to what China achieved, is because China is a horrible, bureaucratic, in many ways inefficient, capitalistic dictatorship. But they simply made a decision: we're going to save lives. Very different from what happened in the West. And the result was, whether the right thing to do or not, is by August, as you can see in 2020, the very place where coronavirus had broken out, Wuhan, they were able to have this kind of big party in a pool back then in August. And this picture, if we go to, this slide sort of shows that situation in numbers. Again, this is going back to June, but of course the disproportionality is more or less the same. I think according to official statistics, Chinese deaths are still at something like 5,000 people. Now, even if the Chinese are lying about that and it's really 50,000 or whatever, it's still very small percentage compared to the total disasters in America and Britain and other Western countries. And if you look closely at this graph, what you'll see is that actually this bit, I can't really point, I'm not a pointer, but the thing on the right, which says deaths per 100,000 population, of course, it says 65.7. It's actually worse in Britain than it is in America. And I think that still might be the case. Britain has really dealt with this exceptionally badly. And I'll suggest why it's not just Boris Johnson's fault. And please, I'm no defender of Boris Johnson. It is because the scientists took on board this obsession with the economy above everything else, which I think is the exact opposite of what scientists should do. So here we have a quote. I'll just run through it. This is from Neil Ferguson on the 25th of March. He was asked by MPs, why is it we didn't copy China? Why didn't we have a lockdown sooner? And he said, had it been possible to manage the epidemic such that it did not exceed healthcare capacity, there would be clear advantages economically to having it over by the end of the summer. When it became apparent that actually there would be no way of managing the epidemic to the extent that healthcare demand in that first wave would not overwhelm the NHS, we moved in some ways slightly reluctantly to look at much more intensive strategies, by which of course he means a lockdown. I say reluctantly because, as I commented before, we will be paying for this year for many decades to come in terms of the economic impact. Now, that to me is proof, others might disagree, that this is epidemiologists just prioritizing the economy over everything else. And that really, I don't think is their decision. And I think this is one of the reasons why things went so badly wrong in this country. And of course, it wasn't just Neil Ferguson, their top mathematical modeler, epidemiologist, who is of course quite famous. It was also his boss amongst the epidemiologists who were on the SAGE committee advising the government. So this is Professor Graham Medley in the middle of March saying, we're going to have to generate what we call herd immunity. And the only way of developing that in the absence of a vaccine is for the majority of the population to become infected. This is the country's top epidemiologist as late as the 13th of March, basically saying everyone's going to have to get this disease. And this was, of course, interpreted, I think, quite accurately by Simon Enright, the NHS Communications Director, that very same day. We want people to be infected with COVID-19. That was the policy in mid-March. Of course, they backtracked pretty rapidly because there was a complete outcry. Hundreds of scientists condemned them and complained to the newspapers. But actually, in some ways, I think British government policy has remained of at least letting people get the disease. I mean, when you watch the statistics up until recently, even today, thousands and thousands getting this disease every day. Britain taking the exact opposite of more sensible countries like New Zealand and China that just don't let people get infected. The end result is deaths, illness, and other ways. Just anyway, I'm getting too emotional. Hopefully I'll calm down by the time we do the discussion. And if you needed any more evidence that herd immunity, i.e. letting people have this disease, was the policy back in the spring, this is from Jeremy Corbyn. He managed to say this in August, but he's talking about March. He says, I remember distinctly going to a meeting at the Cabinet Office where we got a lecture about herd immunity. It was absurd that actually you would build up herd immunity by allowing people to die. And so while the government was going into eugenic formulas and discussing all this stuff, they were not making adequate preparations. Now, the most shocking thing about this quote to me, and others might disagree, is not that Jeremy is telling us that this herd immunity policy was official policy back in the spring. It's that he didn't get around to telling us about it until August. If he had revealed what he knew, what he thought, what he had experienced back in March, he could have warned us all to go into lockdown earlier, even if it hadn't led to a campaign that would have, overthrown the government or stopped the government doing what it was doing. Thousands of people could have gone into lockdown voluntarily and they would have saved their lives. Now, I'm not blaming this on Jeremy's particular incompetence or callousness or anything else. It's just that I think once you get into becoming the official leader of the official opposition and you're in the Privy Council and you're given all these secrets about what the government policy is, your natural instinct is not to share them, not to try and build a mass movement, and it's just to play the establishment game. And here we have Jeremy dressed up rather inappropriately compared to what Jeremy usually wears. He's all dressed up visiting the Queen, and I think there was a visit by the Chinese Premier a couple of years ago. So I sort of, cheekily used that picture. But I think we cannot, whatever we think about Jeremy Corbyn, John McDonnell, Labour Party, I think it's a big error to look to them to save us from the tremendous disasters that tragically really are beginning to affect humanity over the coming decades. We need to look to someone else, and I would suggest it is workers in struggle. And I think, my guess is, I don't know, but my guess is something like paid carers, care workers, nurses, doctors, others probably are the vanguard if we are ever going to get out of this mess of capitalism. And here is an amazing picture. This is right at the beginning of the pandemic in New York. The nurses union were just fed up with what was going on, and they began to organize protests because things were so chaotic there. Maybe I'm just dreaming that such a revolution could take place, but as I said, imagine a scenario in which another pandemic hit us, and as some experts say, that isn't something that's going to happen in 10 years, 20 years. It could happen now. There could be another pandemic as dangerous, more dangerous than coronavirus, could hit us any day now. I mean, it really is that imminent, according to some scientists. And I will give you, this is an example, historically, which I haven't mentioned before, of how when some sections of society, in this case, it was women workers in Egypt's biggest textile factory, Malhala, back in 2006, got fed up with the fact that they'd been pushed around and they weren't being given their bonuses, and they staged a protest. They came out of their factories and they demanded to the men, where are the men, here are the women. And it was this one event, an event that I hadn't heard of until a few months ago when I read about it, and I suspect many people haven't heard of it. This amazing strike that takes place in the biggest textile factory in Egypt back in 2006, and then they repeated the strike in 2007. It is that strike which lays the basis for the entire Egyptian labor movement, which then eventually builds up to the protests during the Arab Spring, and in fact brings down Mubarak. And of course, it's the Arab Spring, which then inspires the Occupy movement, and all the left that we have now in the world is to a greater or lesser extent rooted in this protest movement that started with the women back then. So to me, this is a suggestion. The sort of thing I'm talking about is not inconceivable. It's at least historically realistic. And to go back further in time, I mentioned already the Russian Revolution, the way women initiated that amazingly important historical event. But of course, it wasn't just in Russia, it was France, Italy, here we see Germany. It was women-led food riots, anti-war protests, strikes by women workers, which then inspired the soldiers at the front to stop fighting, to turn their guns against their officers, to end the war, and the war ends in 1918. And of course, if the German Revolution had won, it would have prevented the rise of Hitler, World War II, everything else. I mean, it didn't, but I think it's just another example of how the world can turn upside down in situations of major crisis. And to go back further in history, I'll be coming to an end quite soon, but just to say, this is a quite amazing image of the women of the market women of Paris, fed up with their children starving, say to the men, you are cowards, we're going to take over. We will take over, they said. And they march all the way from Versailles here. They're not messing around, these women. Look, they got pikes and swords and even a cannon. And they go to Versailles to kidnap the king and to get their children and themselves fed. And this is them marching back the next day. They've got the National Guard, the soldiers, the male soldiers have joined them. And they're pretty serious. As you can see, if you look closely on the right there, you'll see heads on spikes. There were some Swiss guards that tried to stop them and they bumped them off. I thought all rather grim, but sometimes revolutions are quite serious. But also there's sort of a party atmosphere. They're waving branches and things around, going back to Paris. And here they are back in Paris, again, celebrating the fact that they have sort of begun to overthrow society and begun to create a situation where their children aren't going to starve to death. And what is very striking about this image, which I didn't notice till quite recently, I was looking at these images and I thought, this really reminds me of something. And what it reminds me is of this, which is a picture that many of you might have seen before, but this is a dance by the Benjeli women. I don't know whether the picture is taken by Jerome or one of these other anthropological colleagues. And of course, the similarity here isn't just that it's, women taking over. It isn't just that they're waving bits of trees or whatever. It's the fact that in both situations, when the women take over, when the people who are doing most of the caring in society, which is the most important thing in any society, take over, they turn everything upside down and everything is possible, and a revolution that really can transform society, that can give us hope in these grim, grim times is possible. And I think there are real connections, and hopefully we can discuss that between both what the Benjeli are still doing and what happened hundreds of thousands of years ago and what is potentially possible in the 21st century. Of course, the big difference between this, the Benjeli women taking over the camp in the Congo, and what happened in France or Russia or other revolutions, is that in those other revolutions in modern history, the women eventually get tired, they get worn down, and they don't keep protesting. And then you get Napoleon, Stalin, and it all goes horribly wrong. Here, with the Benjeli and with hunter-gatherers, the women keep coming out again and again when they need to, and make sure that society doesn't degenerate. And I'll finish, I think this could be my last, oh no, this isn't the last slide. Yeah, just for anyone who has any doubts about the egalitarian communistic nature of hunter-gatherer societies, I suspect not many do have those doubts within the Radical Anthropology group. This is one of the Benjeli men sharing out the meat as exactly as he can in order to emphasize this represents the egalitarianism of that particular society. So any communism is possible. Marx wasn't completely wrong. And in fact, I'm going to have a little quote from Marx, if I can read it out. This is taken from some of his last writings. This was in fact an unpublished letter to the Russian revolutionary Vera Zashishlik, if I've pronounced that right, in 1881. And here he says, the capitalist system in Western Europe, as well as in the United States, is engaged in battle both with the working class masses, with science, and with the very productive forces which it engenders. In a word, in a crisis which will end in its elimination, in the return of modern societies to a superior form of an archaic type of collective property and production. Marx then goes on to say, the vitality of primitive communities was incomparably greater than that of modern capitalist societies. Now, these couple of lines I just find just so amazing, often not quoted by Marxists and others, because, what is he saying here? He's talking about the crisis of Western Europe, United States capitalism. He was well ahead of his time, Marx, of course. Not just talking about the battle between the capitalist system and the working class masses, which you would expect Marx to talk about, but the fact that there's a battle with science. And we couldn't see more clearly the battle between capitalist logic, the ruling class, and their complete inability to harness science to protect us from coronavirus and other ecological catastrophes that are facing us. And I think he's not completely clear, but he says it in other ways, in other words. What he's suggesting is we need to go back to the archaic type, primitive communism, if you like, of collective property and production in a superior form. And as I said, he's making it very clear. He's not having any hesitation saying that what he calls primitive societies. And you've got to bear in mind that, of course, Marx doesn't know quite how egalitarian hunter-gatherer, nomadic hunter-gatherer communities are, because the anthropology isn't available in Europe at the time. But he has a glimpse, he has an idea of how things were different in the past. And we can go back to that at a higher level. So there is some hope, I think, in these grim times, but I'm not expecting anyone to agree with everything I've said. I'm not expecting anyone to agree with even a lot of what I've said, but hopefully this can provoke a bit of debate, discussion, and some ideas. So thank you for listening to me. Hopefully, yeah, I'll finish there.
Could you undo your share screen?
That's probably what I do need to do next. Give me a second. So stop share, the red button. Is that it?
Yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, open floor. Who's first? By the way, you're supposed to disagree. You're not supposed to agree. So, Abiola.
No room, please. No room.
Abiola, okay. Yes, go on.
Hold on. Yeah, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yeah.
Oh, yeah, hi. Hello, Mark. Yeah, thank you very much. I've got quite a bit to say. I just wanted to add to, there's some background, which I think you missed out in terms of the pandemic. And this is, first things first, I think what we have to realize is a lot of the scientists who were speaking were not necessarily epidemiologists. As you said, Neil Ferguson's a mathematical modeler, not an epidemiologist. So, that has an impact. And I'm not sure the government was actually following epidemiology, because the epidemiologist 101 would say to you that what you needed was a fantastic test and trace in place. That would have been carried out by people on the street, knocking at doors and making sure, you have the correct people, and you have to isolate and pay people properly. That didn't happen. That has a background to it, because those epidemiologists, the people doing this stuff would have been environmental health officers from local government, and the Westminster, the Tories, and going back to Blair, they've decimated local authority. That means you don't have these people. So what they've had to do eventually is to take the whole test and trace into some sort of call center. That's wrong. That's just completely wrong. Another thing is, for a society, for a country like the UK, an advanced Western society, should have been, I cannot speak for other countries in Europe and the USA, but for the UK, they should have been ready, but they weren't ready. Why? Because they prepared for the wrong virus, for the wrong pandemic. They were preparing for an influenza pandemic, not the COVID-19, not what we've got. So, and these are two different things, right? And another thing you have to realize is, this was back in March, and we just had the signing of the withdrawal agreement on 31st of January, and there was all this kind of optimism about Brexit and blah blah blah, and then this hit. Now the economy took a hit. They didn't want the economy to take a hit because Brexit was on its way. So this was another reason why they were so focused on the economy, and that's one thing you didn't mention, was Brexit, the impact of it. And we're going to see this come up again in January, in like 3 weeks' time. Watch this space, watch what's going to happen. But there's so much more, going on rather than, just this pandemic. There's stuff going, the politics behind it and everything.
Can I just make a little technical point? Very helpfully, you've all shut down your video, and just as long as you feel comfortable with it, it would be nice for all of us to be able to see who's speaking. But clearly that depends on whether you do feel comfortable. But by all means, feel free to switch on your video while we're having this discussion.
Okay.
So Terry Bloxham is the next with a hand up.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. Not comfortable with turning the video on at the moment, just because of what's going on in the background. But thank you, Mark, very much for your talk. And I just wanted to ask you a question. It's more about the history that we're talking about. And I was wondering if you could comment on the restrictions against what we would call socialist movements in this country, but were called communist movements in the United States in the 1930s Great Depression and on into the 1950s Cold War.
Okay, I'm not sure.
You want to address both points, Mark? Or
Well, I'll try. I'm not sure. The question just now about what you mean McCarthyism and the anti-communist.
Well, what I was, what I didn't want to do was to sort of put words in your mouth, but after the stock market crash and the resultant Great Depression, there were movements by the then president in his first term, Frederick Delano Roosevelt, to mitigate the effects of the Depression by introducing measures in his New Deal to bring people back to work. And the real mastermind behind it was his sidekick for many years, a man called Henry Wallace. And Wallace, I mean, nobody would pick on the president, but people picked on Wallace, kept labeling him a communist. And this got, during the Great Depression, I mean, they basically, any sort of opposition had to cave in because of the extreme nature of what was going on in society. But as things picked up as a result of the war, unfortunately, there was a great deal of opposition to the socialist measures of Henry Wallace, including his plan to introduce what would be very similar to the national health that we have today. And basically, they managed to get rid of him. But I mean, it's interesting, just politically, how people can, place a label. Socialism, as we would call it, was very much communism. And as we all know, America, there's a red under every bed. And I don't know, I just wanted just to chat about it, I guess.
Well, at the risk of sounding very orthodox Marxist about this, the richer a country is, the more advanced the capitalist side. In a sense, the closer it is to socialism. I mean, at a technical level, in terms of the amazing resources of the United States, to create a society in which everyone had enough to eat, had free housing, anything else they wanted, basic substance. It's just there. It could be organized almost overnight for people. So in a sense, socialism is imminent. And I think in that practical sense, not in a political sense, and that's one of the explanations for why that the ruling class and the political class are so paranoid. I mean, so much so that significant sections of them under Trump, supporters of Trump, genuinely believe that Joe Biden next week is going to introduce real communism or real socialism to America. I mean, it's just
No.
saying all he's going to do is well, maybe slightly mitigate the disasters that Trump has created, but in fact, economically, it's exactly the same.
It does seem to be part of a very long scare tactic, you know, to get the population, you know, frightened, you know, oh no, we can't do this, we can't go that way. And that just leads to, I don't know, quite gross capitalism, really. And, you know, with what we have both in the United States and in Britain, as you talked about, was that, you know, obviously we should have a concern for the economy, but then also perhaps we should, you know, temper that and say perhaps we don't need as much as we have become used to, because we've got a crisis going on, and to continue at the same level is just going to increase that crisis. And this seems to have a very long history, as you were, you know, saying, with all of these revolutions in the past. And yes, I totally agree with you that something needs to be done, that something, we need to point this out. And
quite a lot of people wanted to come in. Can I invite anyone else? Ian wants to come in. Is that Ian? Yeah.
And Mark, hi, thanks for your presentation. I just switched my camera on. Can you see me?
Yeah, I can see you, Ian. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm looking at you on another screen. But anyway, so I'm trying to remember the title. It is Global Revolution, yeah? Mark?
The title of the talk, I think, was Revolution in the Age of Coronavirus. Or perhaps I should have called it Revolution in the Age of Pandemics, because, of course, you know, when the coronavirus pandemic is over, it's, there are other pandemics coming down the line, unfortunately.
And presumably you mean now? You're referring, you know,
well, I mean, in the next, who knows, now, next week, in the next 20 years, but, you know, but not in 100 years' time. I mean, we're talking about,
you know. I wanted to ask you about, when I was listening earlier, I was not sure I know what you mean by global revolution. You seem to be projecting into a, you know, into a future. Yeah, you referred to a couple of historical moments, the French and the Russian. But obviously any narrative is going to be essentially be a filtering out any historical narrative of what is clearly a massive, all-encompassing event. And these are really, you know, okay, so I guess we're not really supposed to, you know, define and describe in detail how the revolution will actually be. And in a way, because they are emergent properties, aren't they, out of a present moment. Whatever is going on at the time, they come out of that now, whenever that is. And I just wondered about, you didn't mention any of the current, you know, now revolts, which are coming at us in waves and, you know, happening around the world in waves, you know, still happening in South America, you know, North American revolt. And I thought it was interesting that you described the North American revolt with only one aspect of it. The Black Lives Matter movement is one secondary aspect. There was a George Floyd rebellion which achieved all its objectives in 3 or 4 days. The police was defunded. The police was abolished in Minneapolis by the George Floyd rebellion. Yeah. Now, the Black Lives Matter self-appointed leadership has come along to literally intermediate with the capitalist now. And sometimes I just wonder, you know, what do you mean by revolution? What do you mean by global revolution? If it's not from the perspective of now and the actual revolts that are happening now, and presumably we're only days away from a Mark Duggan revolt in the UK. I mean, how will we relate to that? So I guess let that be my question. Imagine a Mark Duggan rebellion occurs this weekend. What will be your aspect of that? Will be, and no doubt all of us will know some, you know, kind of Islington broom squads that will go out the day after and try and put things back together, because that's why we like it. But personally, I'll be running a mojito bar, and I'd like you to join me at the bar. Oh, Chris, Camilla, all of us, let's agree to meet at the next Britain's Rebellion. I'll bring the mojito. So Mark, yeah, I just wanted to know, how do you relate the present, this revolution moment into now?
Shall I answer that, Chris? Are you?
I think you should, yes.
I shouldn't. Okay. Well, I don't have any easy answers. Usually, whenever I predict anything, as I said, I can, maybe I was discussing with Chris. I don't recall. He might recall. But there was real pessimism back in March, April, because the one thing we knew that appeared to be real was that there's no prospect of mass demonstrations and protests at a time of lockdown and social distancing. You know, we were just desperate for anything, but it clearly wasn't. And then all of this, not just backlight, other things did happen. So any predictions I make are probably bound to be wrong. I in some ways, I rather rely on the ruling class. You may have heard of someone called Henry Kissinger. He helped set up something called the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of these hideous think tanks in, I think it's Washington. And that think tank came up with a study just a few months ago, maybe just last year. He said, which says that we're now in what they call the age of mass protest. This is before Black Lives Matter. The age of mass protest is how they describe the past decade. And they estimate that the frequency of mass protests across the planet has been increasing on average every year by 12%. And I see no reason why the coronavirus is going to stop that happening and continuing to increase in future decades. In fact, they've written something recently about the coronavirus situation, and they say that the pandemic is sowing the seeds for long-term unrest, and this will lead to collapsing trust, and the coronavirus will permanently decrease the confidence of younger generations in political institutions and leaders. Now, who knows whether they're right or wrong, but they probably have more research facilities than I and many of us Marxists do. This is a sort of a right-wing liberal think tank in America. Their system really is coming under huge pressures. The great challenge, and one of the question you asked is about if there's another riots or mass uprising in this country around something like Mark Duggan or whatever, like the police shooting. But yes, and I hope, and things will happen like that, but we need something else, I think, as well as these mass protests to really change everything. And this is why I looked at this idea of something like a carer's revolt, a nurse, I don't know, something else, something qualitatively different, which does really turn everything upside down, not just a series of riots, demonstrations, which then fades away again, something more permanent, and maybe a strike movement, a bit like the movements of the 20th century, maybe something completely new. But it's all about, to some extent, it's about speculating and having an open mind rather than coming up with the answers.
Camilla?
Hi. Yeah, thanks to Ian. Can you hear me okay? I've just got unstable. Thanks to Ian for pushing that we must pay attention to what are the protest movements happening in the world. This day in India, there was perhaps the biggest strike of of world history of the farmers, which is a massive cross-ethnic and cross-faith uprising against Modi regime. Pretty serious stuff. And I like the idea of your beautiful pictures with the Benjele and the French Revolution and the greenery. We've got to, of course, remember that these viruses, the pandemics, are going to come at us because it's directly related to deforestation and the edge of deforestation and the contact with nature, with all these species and the leaping of the viruses from one species to another. So we are really looking at something like a social ecology requirement of women's, I have to come back to Rojava again, which I know Mark is going to have problems with. But I've also got some serious reservations because my sister has told me, so serious reservations about this idea of carers. There are a lot of problems here because my sister has told me she's worked through the year in a clinical hub. She's paramedic, but because of injury, she couldn't be on front line. So she's worked in a clinical hub of the NHS through really traumatic times. Then it got quite relaxed in summer, but it's obviously got worse again. And she says half of the NHS staff in those clinical hubs are saying they don't want to be vaccinated. These are NHS staff. And there's something quite crazy happening here, that people are showing their willingness to resist. They want to resist this ultra corrupt regime that has been foisted on us. But their ways of resisting are quite extraordinary, coming out with a quite extraordinary expression. So the human instinct of resistance is there, but the forms of resistance are, because of breakdown of trust, are attacking, attacking science in ways that are just going completely skew-whiff. My sister is adamant that social media is like a zombie infection of people's brains, and it's hard to disagree with her in a lot of ways. So that there is this real problem. We don't just have movements on the ground that are creating real protest. There was something about the rhythm of the Black Lives Matter, that it arose at a point when the virus care was kind of cooling down. And I know because I went out on some of the demos of Black Lives Matter, because it suddenly felt just that teeny bit safe enough to do it. Today in India, with this huge cross-continental strike, it's also the virus is kind of going. So maybe there's a sort of rhythm that the risk of the virus goes down a bit, and then suddenly the movements come up. But it's the forms of popular resistance. We have seen these defiant demonstrations on the streets from people that just that refuse to be cured of COVID. What is that about? I'm an anthropologist, I'm interested. What is it about?
Mark, do you want me to ask for another contribution?
Yes, please, because I don't have an easy answer to that one. So
Matthew might have support.
So, Matthew Doyle, you've got your hand up. Go for it.
Hi there, guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. Can't see you. I can see a picture of you. That's all right. Yeah.
Okay. So I wanted to pick up on something that Mark said about a parallel he was trying to draw, I think, between the current kind of climate emergency and ecological disaster that we're facing as a species, and the emergence of human behavioural modernity during the Pleistocene. And I think you were making this point, as we know, human behavioural modernity, the emergence of symbolic culture, was the result of the way that our hominid ancestors responded to a period of rapid climate change, which created conditions where group level selection became a significantly more important factor in human evolution. And so it was the fact that human beings during this period of rapid climate change were able to bring about genuine altruistic behavior and cooperation with each other in egalitarian societies, that we were able to survive as groups. And that's what actually drove the evolution of human behavioral modernity. And you seem to be making some sort of parallel between the current situation that we're facing collectively as a species, where we're facing very rapid climate change and ecological disaster. And that, as in the same way that our ancestors had to find a way of reorganizing society and finding a way to behave in a truly altruistic way, in a truly cooperative way, in order to survive and lay the foundations for human culture and human civilization, that at the current time, in order to preserve culture and human civilization, we also have to go through another period of sort of revolution or social change, where we change the basis of human social organization to meet this challenge. And I thought it was an interesting point, and I don't know if it's something that a point that people have made before at the Radical Anthropology group. It's the sort of thing, the sort of parallel that I imagine that you would make. And I just wanted Mark to maybe expand on that a bit more, and also maybe sort of Chris or Camilla, if you had anything to say about that as well.
Shall I come back there?
If you like, yeah.
Well, it's a big guess from my point of view. I mean, it seems implicit in everything we discuss in RAG that this is one way of looking at it. It needs a vast research project to get a real handle on it. But yeah, I mean, well, and to some extent it's banal. Clearly, we are facing extinction, at least in the long run, and clearly, as a species, we certainly faced extinction in our deep evolution in Africa, and every other hominid species did become extinct. And if the RAG theory has anything to go on it, yes, clearly it was that leap that saved us from that. So on the one hand, it's kind of banal what I'm saying. On the other hand, it's a huge leap of the imagination. And of course, what does it mean? You know, does it mean there's anything inevitable about how humanity could survive in the next century? I'm not sure, except at least it shows that we are the same species that made all these changes, whether it's the Russian Revolution, the French Revolution, are going right back 200,000 years ago. There are some similarities between us and these communities and cultures. So maybe all it can do is give us hope, but maybe it can do more than that, which is why I wanted to raise the issue. Sorry, I haven't, yes.
Okay, Matthew invited me and perhaps Camilla or anyone else, of course, to just have a little say in this. Many of us in the radical anthropology group have a view about the establishment of what Matthew termed behavioural modernity. So, I mean, and so that is our interest, really. Our major interest is the emergence of Homo sapiens as a modern species, not just cognitively and anatomically, but behaviourally as well. And yes, I mean, I'll just speak for myself for the moment. So my view is that that was a revolution. It took a while, but possibly the most authoritative statement of the position that the whole history of life on Earth has consisted of a series of major transitions or revolutions, if you like, is John Maynard Smith's extraordinary book, co-authored with Earth Sathmari, the Major Transitions in Evolution. And why that's amazing is because it links up selfish gene Darwinism, which broadly rules out group selection except under exceptional conditions. And I think, Matthew, you're probably right that there is an element of group selection going on when Homo sapiens emerges, but the different groups are doing rather different things, and some of them go extinct and some of them don't. But the major point I wanted to make is that there's a convergence between modern Darwinism, which means genetically informed or selfish gene Darwinism, and that is the only Darwinism which actually works these days. And of course, selfish genes do not mean selfish behavior. All behavior is to some extent made possible by proteins and instincts and so forth. And the most altruistic behavior would still have some genetic basis behind it in terms of capabilities. But what Maynard Smith achieved was a kind of convergence between fractal geometry or complexity theory or chaos theory, if you like, and Darwinism. So, and the argument was that the origin of life, the emergence of multicellular organisms, the origin of whole social systems, the emergence of language, and each of these is not just a revolution, but a revolution of a similar kind in the sense that what seems to have happened is that a certain kind of selfishness on one level, which was actually obstructing the emergence of a new whole level of complexity, at a certain point, that's transcended and a completely novel level of complexity emerges. So, for example, it seems very unlikely that a self-replicating cell in the period of the planet's life, when all cells just replicated quite autonomously, you just split and split and split and make lots of copies of yourself. Why on earth would a cell find any advantage in teaming up with lots of other cells, particularly when most of the cells actually aren't allowed to replicate, which is what all of us are. Each one of us, of course, is a kind of city. And most of the cells just are prevented from replicating, except of course the gametes or sex cells. But the interesting point, which I'll sum up quickly, Maynard Smith and Sathmari say that each revolution, in some sense, repeats the previous revolution. In fact, the whole series of previous revolutions, and even more interestingly, kind of prefigures and anticipates the revolutions to come. So by looking at the emergence of, say, the transition, the Cambrian explosion, the emergence of multicellular organisms, and working out what happened then, what were the barriers to that happening, and what were the conditions, the unusual, very, very unusual conditions which made those barriers sort of break. By looking at that revolution, you can actually see the formal logic of the next revolution and the next one and the next one. And if that's true, then it just kind of follows logically that if there is to be a future for our species, if we do manage another revolution, it's kind of logically true that it must in some sense be a repetition on a higher level of the human revolution. And just one last point to make is that the way in which we see it in RAG is just, without conflict, there's no change. If there's complete harmony in the system, then nothing's going to happen. It's going to stay there. So all change is driven by conflict. So Karl Marx's idea that class conflict is the driving force behind historical change, that's mirrored in the way we think in terms of primate evolution, hominid evolution, by a different kind of conflict. And it could conceivably, it could be sort of territorial conflict, kind of warfare. That is a whole theory, that warfare was between different groups was what drove the emergence of Homo sapiens without sort of group level morality. We don't think that at all in RAG. We think the crucial thing is something much more fundamental and possibly creative, which is sexual conflict. And sexual conflict in this sense would tie up with what Marx is saying, because we think that evolving human females increasingly had good reason to band together, form alliances, and increasingly sort of domesticate the opposite sex, bring the male sex into provisioning helpfully and assisting with childcare, as opposed to using their capacities for violence, which can be quite useful, of course, capacities for violence if you're getting into hunting and gathering. But bring female courages were necessary, needed to harness male energies in that new way, and that led to what we call the human revolution. And the argument we make is that yes, we succeeded once. Here we are. The revolution clearly worked. We're all humans. We've got the kind of eyes and bodies and minds that came out of that revolution. We did it once, and so we can do it again.
I think Ian wanted to say something again, and he was talking about capitalism facing extinction. Oh, do you want to say something, Ian?
Well, yeah, I just wanted to respond to Mark's statement that humans are facing extinction. I mean, it is conjecture, and we're not actually able to kind of project that far. Okay, so maybe your global revolution is some kind of survivors list. Maybe mine is too. It's clear we're facing, evolutionary challenges. I think we're looking at a quantum leap which is similar to that leap from animal behavior to a semantic, cognitive, cultural revolution where we organize collaboratively. We are seeing, people around the world risking everything to organize collaboratively.
Yeah.
We will be in the survivors lists. There will be many. But life will transform, no doubt. We're going to see extinctions. But, I just think there is this huge kind of element of adopting, too much of the narratives that's going on about, it's capitalist society which is under threat. Our supply lines that we depend on are vulnerable. If a country like Britain has got more than 50% of its foods coming from abroad right now, in 3 weeks, we could be facing shortages on the shelves, which would be a lot more significant than toilet roll.
Sure, stock your cupboards, folks.
We need to think about resilience and how we find a lifeboat. But there will be so many. There is such an urge to meet this challenge that we will, and I think there is a very good chance that we will reach our emissions targets, not by any government plans, but by the dissolution of government's plans. And while that's occurring, we need to independently build for that revolution. Right. That revolution will face the state's incursions against us, as we do all the time. I mean, all species face the threat of extinction at all times. And that's how they develop their behavior to adapt, is it not? And we're good at that. We're going to do it. But I'm done.
Personally, I think that's brilliant, Ian. But I doubt whether Mark is disagreeing with you somehow. But anyway, but I just will say, I mean,
Can I just say one thing?
Okay, go on. Yeah, so yeah.
Yeah.
Whoever
That's
that
okay.
is.
Yeah. I just, yes, sorry, yeah, I'm just bursting to say something, which is basically, I don't think we've got decades. I think we've got 8 years. I honestly think we've got 8 years before the humans can become, you know, more or less extinct, apart from hopefully the Mbangeli may survive with their lifestyle. I think, you know, obviously with globalization and factory farming has increased the zoonotic probability of disease, which, you know, as some of you said, can happen tomorrow again. And of course it'll be, you know, the effects of climate change that will be really gigantic problems for us. But I think, you know, it's the way we are treating animals, not just animals, but factory farming. You know, there's huge farms now in Ireland. You know, there's these mink farms in Denmark. I mean, I know it's only a small example, but if you take that worldwide, you know, all these animals are being factory farmed and all the antibiotics they need, you know, it's just causing us huge parallel problems as well as climate change. I mean, it's all part of the same problem, obviously, you know, and this happened 10,000 years ago. I mean, in Jared Diamond's book, The World Until Yesterday, which was published in 2012, he talks about what happened then, that disease was transferred from the domestication, you know, because of domestication of animals, transferred from the animals, such as pigs and cattle, to humans. And the health of the humans deteriorated to a great extent. I just think, you know, we're talking about 8 years. So I just feel, you know, we've got to have solutions by then.
I just wanted to say, that's good.
And I
wanted to say about Ian's contribution. I think the most brilliant point you made there, Ian, was to say we may indeed meet our emissions targets. In like DIY, we'll do it ourselves, and the states around the world are completely incapable of doing it. But if we can do it, that's a very optimistic sign, and we need to get that optimistic message out. It's like a DIY meeting of the emissions targets. That's a brilliant idea. It reminds me of Reclaiming the Streets, when people were sort of saying, oh, how do we sort out pollution, and how do we deal with, you know, all the kind of crap of sort of, you know, cars in streets and fumes and stuff. And Ian was one of the many of us at that time in the mid-90s. We just came up with, okay, what about do it yourself? Just occupy the streets and have a wonderful time, have a party, and do it again and again and again. And there's so many benefits from doing that, because you just realize that, yes, we can actually enjoy social life, have a party, get to know our neighbors, and so many spin-offs from just doing that simple DIY direct action thing, and we need to reapply that today. So I think that's a brilliant way. But of course, and it's right. I mean, we don't have all the time in the world.
Well, the point is, at the moment, we are absorbing too much of this fear, this vulnerability. The vulnerability is located in our supply lines. But not everybody is dependent on those supply lines at the same rate. There are plenty of people living off-grid. There are plenty of people already taking land and growing food. Now, okay, if we are particularly dependent, and we can do an equal graph of fear of extinction, fear of death. There's no limit. There's no 8-year limit coming downwards, because there's all kinds of possible courses of action that people will take. This government couldn't predict effectively how well we would lock down. We locked down voluntarily. There was no quarantine. We all, as a population, out of the love of each other and everyone else, we reduced our behavior. And that's, you know, we're going to be more and more in that position of organizing our own survival, basically. But that, you know, but the point is that we've got to get to a point of organizing our own life. You know, the point is we're not going back to new normal, because that was already crap. People were low paid doing important, caring jobs. That's not got to be like that. We're going to organize for living. That's what we're going to do. But we've got to remember, revolutionary moments happen when people feel confidence, when they feel confident in each other, when they feel they can rely on everybody's in the same state of mind. We will take action together. We will risk everything together, because it will be better. We might get hurt, but it will be better. That's the important thing. You know, we've got to get that sense of confidence. We've got to take it back from this idea that we are definitely facing extinction. We're facing a challenge. We can overcome it, but we need the confidence, and we need a lot more people to be ready to take action.
Is your hand still up, or is it just up there?
Yeah, I did put it up again. I mean, Abby also had her hand up.
Okay.
Does Abby want to talk, and then I will?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to quickly add to, you know, this extinction thing. Okay, we shouldn't really get negative, but let's be realistic. We cannot rule it out. If you look at Mark Linus's 6 degrees, if we go up to 6 degrees, and we know cutting the emissions, our emissions target is way off track. Even in lockdown, it's gone way off track. So, and we're not simply dealing with climate change. Unfortunately, what's happened in the past few years is climate change has taken over the whole discussion, and it's a much deeper issue. We have biodiversity loss. In the past few days, I've been reading about soil. Our soil is in crisis. We're running out of water. We have a systems failure that is not just climate change, it is so many things out there. There isn't one single metric where we're doing okay. Everything is in crisis. And when you're at that stage, you know you cannot rule out extinction. I'm not saying it's definitely going to happen, but you cannot rule it out. We're in crisis.
Okay, I just want to agree with Ian's point about revolution and confidence. But if we also draw from Mark's examples of all these women-led, women-edged revolutions, starting from the human revolution and the French and the Russian, and the various other movements showing the Egyptian women there, this happens at a point when women cannot feed their children, and then suddenly all bets are off, and then everything is going to change. Women go there with something like desperation, but it's also certain levels of confidence of what's shared amongst them. We desperately need, and there will be women's populations around the world which will have massively more capacity for solidarity than amongst the sort of general women's populations in the West, which are very divided in terms of class and access to resources and ethnicity and so on. But that, this trick of cooperation that women need is absolutely critical. Locating it amongst staff as staff of the carers of the NHS or the carers in general, it's a very good place to start. It's a very good place to understand where it needs to happen. But it's going to be desperate times, which may be coming very shortly, that will mobilize. I agree that something can spark it. We can't predict.
Is there anyone who hasn't spoken who wants to chip in?
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to come back a bit, Mark, if no one else is saying anything?
Well, just to say, I mean, I don't know, really. Whether we are facing imminent extinction or we're just going to hang around for another 500 or 2,000 years, but whatever, you know, or maybe when I say we're facing extinction, I merely mean we're facing the end of, I don't know, global mass society, and we'll just end up, you know, a tiny elite surviving in some high-tech pods somewhere, and the rest of us just dying off. Which is, to me, that's almost the same as extinction. It wouldn't be human community anymore. It would just be this nightmare science fiction. And we you know, there is no. The coronavirus pandemic is an example of something that was, for many of us, only really in science fiction up until it began to happen, and then it happened, and yeah, we are on a knife. We just don't know. We don't know what could happen, how bad it could. There's been a debate within and around Extinction Rebellion about whether you really should be pushing this idea that extinction is imminent in the next decade or two, and therefore, but of course, once you know that is the case, that leads to really quite reactionary politics often. So I think we should stay a bit clear of that. I think the very important thing is that no matter how, I'm all in favour of people living off grid and doing their own thing and transition towns and all that kind of thing, because we can learn a lot from that, but that is not going to save us. I don't think. We have to change industrial production, transform it, and most of that, a lot of that's now taking place in China. Whatever we do here is pretty irrelevant. We need an international global revolution which, you know, connects with the working class women, men in China and transforms the entire globe, much like the Arab Spring led to Occupy, began to do worldwide. This is clearly imminently potential. We have potential for that. Camilla raised the very difficult issue of how many care workers and nurses are apparently a bit paranoid and don't want to have the vaccine and this kind of thing, and looking at things. I think it's basically this extreme individualism because no one trusts the government. And one of the more contradictory aspects of this coronavirus pandemic, maybe it's just in my life, but I suspect in many of our lives, is the way I've been looking to independent SAGE. People have heard of this group of scientists and modelers and health experts and others all coming together. And now they've become really kind of the official opposition. They sort of make suggestions and a couple of weeks later the government listens to them and implements it. But there was a time earlier in the year when they sort of almost came across like a sort of an alternative government or even like a revolutionary organization, because they were the only people with the expertise who were just saying, no, this government policy is ridiculous. They're killing us. We need an alternative possible. And these very quite respectable health experts and modelers and others sort of came across as revolutionaries. Like you can imagine a scenario in the future, hopefully, where in a sense, people do begin to realize how desperate things are, where the ruling class really have lost it, and where otherwise, if you like, sensible people start becoming leaders of the revolution, whether they like to or not. This is not just nurses, but also the top scientists and others. And you can, I don't know, there's something about the way Independent SAGE acted in the early months of this crisis. And you could see a sort of a counterpower developing at that level. I'm not suggesting for 1 minute that we want to have the experts in charge. They obviously have to be part of a much wider movement. And then, of course, once you do begin to get that mass movement of opposition with a real practical alternative to the disasters of the capitalist class, then this paranoid individualism, anti-vax attitude just dwindles. And the challenge is how to get to that.
Oh, I can see Dawn. Dawn, hi Dawn. Dawn from UEL. Thank you. It's great to see you, comrade.
Hello.
yeah, over to you.
I accidentally put my hand up there. I've been hovering, but I'm a bit rusty academically, so you'll have to excuse me for being probably a little bit basic and guttural rather than well thought out. But I've got a few things that have come up from the things that people have said, which is, so for example, first of all, I'm just not sure. I would love to think that there will be a revolution from this. Chris would know that I would think that, but I'm not sure that it will happen. And the reasons that I'm not sure that it will happen is that I think we are so disparate as a community now, as a global community, but even more than that, as a national community, and even in our own communities. Caring has been commodified. So it's all very well thinking that, you know, low paid carers, blah, 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 but actually it's not even that they're low paid. You know, they're not valued, or there is no community. I've worked in those homes, you know, there is no community of agency staff who do a lot of the caring. We as a community don't do the caring anymore. You know, we've almost gone back to those sort of Victorian times, haven't we, where we ship people out to the home counties. and stuff like that. What we do now, though, is we put them into little homes in our communities. We let someone else look after them. We don't do it. Or half the time, they don't even have relatives picking them up. So my thing about revolution, and my question, I guess, would be, is how do resistance is happening, that's true, but it's all about different things. You know, you go to the marches and the protests that have been taking place during COVID, and you will get the far right along with people who have never protested before, along with, there is no cohesion there except for the fact that they believe their rights are being taken away. When it comes down to, half of them are fighting for capitalism. I mean, that's the point. They're not all there. They're not all left-wing people fighting to bring down capitalism. They're fighting to save it. They want the economy open. They want us to get back working. They want us to start chucking our taxes in again. You know, they believe we've got to pay this deficit back. So, so what, I don't know, where does a revolution come from when you're faced with the most unequal, I mean, I know I'm talking from a Eurocentric, you know, viewpoint, but, you know, where does the cohesion come from for a revolution that is gonna bring down capitalism or, you know, do anything that probably the people in this group would like to see? That's me.
Thanks for being basic, Dawn. Yeah.
Sorry?
Thanks for being basic. Necessary, very necessary. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, can't I just say one thing?
You can say lots of things.
I hesitate. I was introduced as an anarchist, and I'm not a Trotskyist. My politics has always been a bit to the left of that. But Trotsky did say one thing in his famous History of the Russian Revolution. He said that revolutions take place when there is no other way out. And we certainly are heading to that situation. So I think that is a glimpse of hope from Trotsky there. You know, revolutions don't happen just because people want to have revolution or whatever. They haven't, because there's no other way we can change that. And people don't quite get that yet. They still have some hope in their individual ability to refuse to have a vaccine, in their ability to get a job or to have a bit of property. And that individualism, there'll come a point where that will just not be practical at all. And no matter how terrifying it'll be, people will have to start coming together collectively. And that's when I think this sort of anti-vax individualism might begin to drift away. And I mean, I have friends who work in the care home sector. I have had relatives who passed away in care homes quite recently, and I've seen the conditions, and they're absolutely appalling. And yes, they're not a situation where you would imagine the carers are out going to go on into the streets anytime soon. But on the other hand, in America, for instance, the most powerful left-wing union is the nurses' union now, you know, strong supporters of Bernie Sanders. They did come out to some extent, you know, at the early period of this pandemic. And it's not hard to imagine a situation where another pandemic hits us and American nurses stage strikes and then inspire wider uprisings. And of course, as we've seen, when things happen in America, they can often spread right around the world. And then suddenly these care workers, completely atomized, isolated, exploited in care homes all over Britain, it might start thinking they can act. And of course, once they do act, I mean, look at the support that the nurses and others got, the NHS workers got with the clapping and all that, you know. Once they act and say, we've had enough of this government, we've had enough of capitalism, care of children, of the elderly, of the vulnerable, of the ill has to be the #1 priority in society. Society will turn upside down, but how we get there, that's another question.
You know, so say all the nurses and the carers got in the streets, Mark. What levers have they got? You know, what exactly? How exactly are they going to redistribute more funding to their pay packets? You know, it doesn't matter how many peaceful marches we have from any sectors of the workforce. We have to basically, you know, notice the the point where the states are currently dissolving. Their power to determine the streets is dissolving, as it did in France last Saturday and the Saturday before. And this is because of a widespread hostility to the state in its place as the state. We're not going to be able to affect the levers in the current moment to improve the current failing capitalist moment. It's going to get worse. We're going to have to crowdfund it, crowdsource it. We're going to have to simply rebuild from the bottom up. And we might as well start thinking about that now, because it can only get worse. And these states, as they are arranged, embedded with corporate extraction companies, still being funded by public money via these states, who are floating these military operations which way outstrip any effect, still not considered in the COP6, whatever we're at, whatever stage we're at, but the climate talks which are coming will not contemplate the military carbon footprint, the military spend. You know, all of that has to go. All of that has to be dissolved if we are to make it. So it's clear that our societies, as we're arranged, aren't making it. The question is, how do we want to reorganize?
I do think that at some point, Ian and others, we need to sort of nail things down a little bit into kind of action that some of us think we actually can take in the light of what's going to happen in Glasgow in a year's time. I mean, I know, obviously, Ian, you're absolutely right. There's no way that what happens in the COP conference in Glasgow is going to be solving anything, but it will be a sort of soundboard. It will provoke, you know, responses. There will be all kinds of, you know, different from every different quarter, you know, people begging, pleading, threatening, whatever, these delegates. And we need something spectacular, creative, imaginative, which might just conceivably, you know, send out a message quite widely. And we might actually we've got a surprising amount of support from, you know, women in India, from, you know, I mean, from all over the place. And I don't know, it seems to be a bit of a responsibility, because I mean, to kind of do nothing on the grounds that nothing's going to happen would obviously be crazy. And so I'm not saying this particular meeting, this Zoom meeting, we can come to any decisions, but at a certain point, all of us, whoever we are, we need to sort of start nailing things down to some action. You know, I don't know. Has anyone got any ideas? I suppose I'm asking.
There's a precedent in this independent SAGE committee that you're referring to. You know,
you've gone very quiet, Ian. Do something.
Yeah, the microphone.
Nothing's changed at my end. Can you hear me now?
Oh dear. It's very quiet suddenly. That's better.
Try it.
Speak more closely to the microphone now.
Still distant, yeah.
Still distant. Not sure what I can do to affect that. Any better now?
Not really. You were fine just a moment ago.
Oh. Not sure.
Let's speak loudly then.
Okay, so what was I trying to say? Lost my train.
That's it. You come back.
I've come back. Great.
Yeah.
Can you get my thought back now?
Oh, God, that's a harder one.
What was I going on about? Oh God. Sorry.
I'll let you off if you like. I've got Jacob lined up.
Shall I put something in and maybe you'll have thought of it then?
There's Camilla and then Jacob.
Well, Jacob, you haven't spoken. Why don't you go? Jacob?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm not an academic, so I can't even get to basic. But from the arts, the thing that struck me most from the presentation and from the experience is living in New York and seeing my culture throw boxes in the ground with no ritual. No capacity to experience through symbolic anything what we're going through. And so as an artist, the human origins theory that Reg has given me resonates, and especially in this, with fear through the human community is transition to joy, that we can reverse all of the negative signals of our primate heritage. And so the fear is always there. It was big cats that were much larger than us, and we're faced with our own extinction every night. And we used song. We turned the fear signal into a smile, and we turned tears into laughter. So this fear of annihilation is something that is always with us. And it is what, in my experience, we use ritual to instigate, so we don't actually have to come up to it literally. And because we've lost this cultural connection to any type of temenos, any type of ritual centering, it's going to take an actual literal cliff, as long as we're throwing boxes in the ground with bodies in them and not feeling it. And so for me, the way forward is not looking at the revolution, is not facing violence with violence, not facing male dominance with more dominance and seeing if we can win with more anger and violence, but to flip it and to bring grief into the body, to bring joy into the body, and to create community and extending the in-group through the arts and through massively costly symbolic movements that take a lot of energy and a lot of resources, and what we get back from it is each other, that we are not in this alone. And so that if that in-group expands, then we start taking care of each other without thinking about it. The kin structure, what we experience in a nuclear family, extends to the neighborhood, extends to the bioregion. Bioregions start dancing at full moon, and suddenly you have a larger global community. But I think the fear is good. It's just how can we translate it into some type of ritual and some type of joy, some type of carnival.
That's well said, and that is what Reclaim the Streets managed to do. We turned the anger into a real celebration. And we did them. We had the repetitive beats that Margaret Thatcher tried to ban legally. We had the samba, we had the puppets, we had the costumes, we had we really managed to do a lot of that. But above all, what we did not do was think in terms of let's bring like-minded people together. Whenever I hear let's bring like-minded people together, I don't know, I won't say I reach for my gun, but I feel like puking, because that's the absolute last way to go. We don't want like-minded people coming together. What we did with Reclaim the Streets, we brought together the opposite ends of the spectrum. We brought together people who'd never had a job in their life with people, dockers fighting for their jobs. And in between those extremes, those poles, we had the whole future society. Actually, Reclaim the Streets turned into a massive, massive movement, and it was one of the crucial origins of Seattle and so many other things. So I totally support the idea, and I know that Ian does as well. It's not certain that nobody here is thinking you just answer violence with violence, but it is true that we need to be realistic. We need to be well equipped. We need to make sure that we're not sitting ducks, but of course the greatest weapon really is the huge amount of joy and support and confidence which comes out in a revolution. So I perhaps to just say to Dawn, I mean, and a lot of us have said that. I mean, it's just so surprising when a revolution does break out, how many people from how many different directions suddenly find a shared voice and a feeling of kind of love and power and passion, which actually can move mountains and can change, can turn the world upside down. So Ian, did you want to come back? Did you discover your lost thought? You need to put your mic on. Yeah,
Mark, you were talking about the Independent Sage group, and there was clearly a rapid U-turn in Downing Street. Yeah, at the beginning of the pandemic, the February 3rd speech. Have you heard the February 3rd speech when Johnson was in the Greenwich Observatory?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
Just after Brexit moment, and here we are on the stage. We need, while the world goes into economic segregation over a panic over this new virus. We can charge. We need to come out of the phone booth with our Kate flying. It was unbelievable.
Yeah.
So we were on course on February 3rd for herd immunity, and some bunch of scientists who are clearly part of the scientific community, as you guys are, and you know, I'm kind of following these climate guys on Twitter who are just desperately putting out this stuff, you know, collapse, mayhem. Well, organize to that committee, organize a message through your community, your science community, to that committee. You've already pulled off a U-turn in Tory policy. You already panicked the Tories. You know, when I say you, I'm talking to, you know, independent sage, basically. Surely it's embedded in a scientific community, you know, community. You know, it's like, but at the moment, all the scientists are still, like I was basically, you know, I suppose, you know, challenging you, Mark, saying you're viewing, in a sense, it's like, how do we save the current arrangement of society? Well, we have to accept that's not happening. We have to all get to the lifeboats. We have to bring important people with us. We have to bring a certain amount of the people that are around the power, basically. And then there comes a moment when all power dissolves. And that's a critical moment which we have to envisage. I think we have to, you know, think about how do we do that, because we need certain things to operate. We need centralized water. We need centralized health distribution, it seems, although we're probably going to have to be a lot more locally resilient with, you know, self-organized care. I mean, you know, and a certain amount of voluntaristic, you know, social welfare was already started in the first lockdown, you know, and that no doubt continues. It gets absorbed into the states, misorganization, but we've got to basically insulate against that and federate and network. I'll mute myself again now.
We've got 5 minutes more. We've got 5 minutes until 8:30.
Can anybody hear me? Nima Masterson.
Very quietly, if you could speak up a bit. I can only just hear you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
So is that better?
Yes, much better.
Brilliant. Okay. Well, thank you very much. This is my first time joining your group, and I found the discussion to be very stimulating and critically informed. So I'll be joining again. I just wanted to touch upon some of the thoughts I had as the discussion was going on. Specifically, the comment that was made about what role, what can we do, what action can we take. Well, I've joined this discussion today because I felt that the position that anthropology can take as a mode of as an approach which recognizes what it means to be human, or what we human beings can become. You know, we're like, if we're facing a species potential extinction, then what is it about us that may give us reason and encouragement and that confidence to believe that we can overcome the challenges we're facing. And I think the answer is in our very bones. It's in that rich history that we've evolved ever since we you know, came out of ancestors. And in terms of where we can look today and what kind of social sphere we can look for encouragement as to a catalyst for any social change, I think it's got to be young people. They're now growing up in an age where the future is looking more and more bleak. And as I think it was touched upon, social media and the corrosive effects that that's having on people's well-being, on social relationships, on people's capacity to think through the problems that we're facing. And I think that young people are feeling increasingly disaffected, that there is no future. And the role that we might have in terms of taking action is to develop a communication that can resonate with young people. And I think that's where anthropology and the approach that you guys have taken can be really, really useful, because you're talking. I mean, what I've really enjoyed about this discussion is that the conversation feels very human. It's very different from that kind of you know, the kind of usual Marxist talk, which is full of maybe dogma and jargon, and maybe young people would find quite alienating. I mean, there's something I'm hearing hearing expressions of turning from crying to joy, from and things like this. And I think it's so, yeah, I'll leave it there, but yeah, thank you very much.
We've only got a few minutes, so perhaps shall we ask Mark to sum up? I do want to stop at 8:30 because people expect that. They've got childcare and various other things to get back to. So can we, do you feel like saying a bit, Mark?
Yes, happily. Well, firstly, thank you for listening to me, and thanks for an interesting discussion. These are huge issues. I'm sure the discussion and debate will continue at RAG and elsewhere. I'm just going to quote something from the ITV journalist Robert Peston. Those who, well, those in Britain would know about this character. Now, he wrote that on the 11th of February, and that's really early on in this pandemic, in this year, a senior member of the government briefed me that there was a risk that 60% of the population, the British population, would become infected with coronavirus, and that at a mortality rate of 1%, 500,000 would die. So what, as early as the 11th of February, this government knew how unbelievably serious this was, and they did nothing. For weeks and weeks and weeks, they took that risk of 500,000 British citizens dying because they were more concerned, and this isn't just Boris Johnson, I think this is the whole establishment really, they were more concerned about keeping this thing called the economy going. Now, whatever else we think about hopelessness or despair, there was something happened within British society, including journalists and huge sections of people I wouldn't necessarily agree with, who realized what was going on, if only instinctively, that the government were trying to kill us, basically, and they complained. This was scientists, this was journalists, this was other people, and it stopped them to some extent. I mean, it hasn't been good, have died. To that extent, there was a fight back. It wasn't completely hopeless. We have saved perhaps hundreds of thousands of lives because we didn't go along with what the scientists and the top scientists, not all scientists, but what the leading scientists, those who wanted knighthoods, and the government originally wanted. So there is some hope. And in terms of something more drastic than that, which would actually change things, so we haven't got to be in these ridiculous dilemmas, i.e. revolution, there's something. The scenario I'm guessing about is one where something like everything from independent sage to nurses to unions to other situations, where they really find themselves not just in a position where they can push the government or they can advise the government, but one in which the government and the ruling class are completely ignoring them because the crisis has gone to such a head that there is no choice. You either stick with the establishment or you transform things entirely, and then sections of society, even those apparently as conservative as Jonathan King, the former Tony Blair science advisor on the SAGE committee, might start coming around to the right side. And certainly, of course, that only works if it's a much wider movement. And the very difficult question that keeps coming up is, surely care workers, nurses, others, how can they lead the revolution? They're so atomized and not as organized as we'd like them to be. But just imagine a scenario in which there is a massive pandemic facing us, and care workers from care homes, nurses and others just get onto Zoom meetings and start speaking to Amazon workers, to tube workers, to teachers and others, and just say, we can't do it on our own. You've got to go on strike now. You've got to close this economy down. You've got to overthrow the government. We cannot go to another pandemic that kills 100,000 people. I can imagine that happening. Something like that is really possible, but of course it's just speculation. But at least we've got to keep our mind open. to such possibilities. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Thanks, everybody, and see most of you, some of you, hopefully next week, when we're it's sort of now for something completely different. We're looking at a fairy story, and it's The Shoes That Were Danced to Pieces, which, believe it or not, has a sort of revolutionary kernel, although at first sight it may not look as if it does. And then it's a holiday for the winter for all of us. But okay, everybody, thanks. Some of those comments, by the way, most of your comments I thought were absolutely marvelous and brilliant. So thanks very much. Okay, bye everybody.